March 9, 1945. Guam. Inside the operations room of the 21st Bomber Command, the air was heavy with smoke and silence. Major General Curtis LeMay leaned over a massive plotting table, his eyes fixed on reconnaissance photographs of Tokyo. Not one single industrial giant like the plants in Detroit or Pittsburgh. Instead, thousands of tiny machine shops, family-owned factories, and makeshift production sheds hidden within the fabric of Tokyo's residential wards. Aircraft engine parts made in wooden houses, navigation instruments assembled in temples, munitions casings hammered out in back-alley sheds. The Empire's war machine had been scattered deliberately among neighborhoods built almost entirely of wood and paper. American precision bombing campaigns had failed. At 30,000 feet, the jet stream tore bomb loads off course. High-altitude raids meant ton after ton of bombs falling miles from their targets. Weeks of missions against the Nakajima aircraft plant had inflicted less than 5% damage. Losses mounted, confidence in the B-29 program faltered, and the political stakes climbed higher each day. Washington demanded results. The Navy insisted its carriers could cripple Japan more effectively. The Army prepared for invasion, convinced the air war would never break the Empire. That night, LeMay shifted the entire equation. Instead of high-altitude daylight raids, the bombers would strike low, at night, stripped of defensive weapons, carrying maximum incendiary payloads. Napalm-filled bomblets would replace explosives, designed not to puncture steel, but to ignite wood and paper across vast urban districts. Fire would do what precision bombs could not. Meteorologists reported favorable winds and dry conditions across Tokyo's eastern wards. The calculations were clear. If the bombers ignited enough small fires at once, they would merge into a conflagration no defense system could contain. At 5:35 p.m., the first B-29 lifted off from Guam. In the hours that followed, hundreds more rose into the darkening sky from Saipan and Tinian. Each aircraft carried 6 tons of incendiary clusters, each cluster designed to scatter dozens of individual firebombs across neighborhoods already identified by reconnaissance. Below those flight paths lay one of the densest human populations on Earth. Families asleep in paper-walled houses, unaware that within hours their city would become the stage for the single most devastating firebombing campaign in recorded history. Shortly after midnight on March 10, 1945, the first Pathfinder bombers crossed into Tokyo airspace. At just 5,000 feet, the B-29s flew so low that crews could see street lamps flickering below. Their mission was to drop marker flares, brilliant white trails that would guide the waves of bombers that followed. Within minutes, the first incendiary clusters began to fall. Thousands of small bomblets burst open mid-air, releasing streams of napalm gel that clung to rooftops, walls, and streets. Fires ignited instantly, bright orange patches spreading like veins across the city grid. By 1:30 a.m., entire wards were burning simultaneously. The design of Tokyo itself amplified the destruction. Narrow lanes and tightly packed homes acted as conduits for firestorms. Roofs made of wood shingles and bamboo mats ignited at the slightest spark. Water lines ruptured almost immediately, cutting off firefighting efforts. Families fled into the canals, hoping the water would shield them. But napalm gel floated, burning even on the surface. Survivors described people plunging into rivers, only to be set alight as flaming debris drifted downstream. The firestorm sucked oxygen from the streets, creating hurricane-force winds that toppled buildings and drew screaming residents into walls of flame. Inside the cockpits of the bombers, aircrews felt shock at the sight unfolding below. Some reported turbulence so severe it came not from weather, but from the rising heat columns. The firestorm lifted aircraft hundreds of feet without warning, while ash and smoke made navigation almost impossible. Still, the crews flew their patterns, releasing wave after wave of incendiaries. In less than 3 hours, over 1,600 tons of napalm fell across Tokyo. The scale of devastation exceeded all projections. Neighborhood after neighborhood disappeared into a continuous sheet of fire stretching miles across the city. Observers later noted that it was not a series of isolated blazes, but a single burning entity, an urban inferno visible from 150 miles away. The sound was described as a roar louder than any engine, the collective scream of a city consumed in flames. In the underground shelters, heat reached unbearable levels, forcing people to claw their way to the surface only to be caught by collapsing buildings or firestorms raging above. The bombing had not just struck military production sites, it had engulfed the civilian heart of Japan's capital, reducing districts that had existed for centuries into smouldering ash by dawn. By dawn on March 10th, the eastern wards of Tokyo were unrecognizable. What had once been a dense urban sprawl of workshops, schools, shrines, and family homes had collapsed into a vast plain of glowing embers. The Koto, Chuo, and Sumida districts bore the heaviest toll. Witnesses reported entire neighborhoods erased in less than 30 minutes, leaving only blackened chimneys protruding from ash-covered ground. Bridges across the Sumida River became choke points where thousands tried to flee, only to find both ends engulfed in flames. Many never escaped. Civil defense systems crumbled almost instantly. Fire brigades lacked the water pressure and equipment to fight walls of flame stretching for miles. Pumps ran dry as mains ruptured, and buckets proved useless against napalm that clung to surfaces even after dousing. Air raid shelters became death traps as the firestorm consumed available oxygen, suffocating families who had sought safety underground. Streets filled with refugees carrying children, dragging carts and clutching bundles of possessions, yet few routes led to safety. In canals and rivers, the dead floated in clusters, victims of heat and smoke as much as fire. Survivors later recalled the unnatural force of the winds. Firestorms created vortices that uprooted trees and hurled debris through the air. Roof beams and burning boards became projectiles. People were lifted from the ground and pulled into the flames as if by invisible hands. Those who survived described the smell of burning tatami mats, lacquer, and human flesh mingling in a haze that coated the city with choking soot. The night sky turned crimson, reflected against columns of black smoke that towered into the stratosphere. When the bombers turned back toward their island bases, Tokyo no longer resembled a functioning city. Reconnaissance reports compiled later that day estimated that 60 square miles of the capital had been annihilated, an area larger than the entire city of Washington, D.C. At least 100,000 people were killed in a single night, the majority civilians, with over 1 million left homeless. It was, at that moment, the most destructive air raid in history, surpassing the casualties of Hiroshima and Nagasaki individually. For the Allied command, it was framed as proof that incendiary saturation could succeed where precision bombing had failed. For Japan, it marked the beginning of a campaign that would target not just its war industry, but its very capacity to sustain urban life. In the weeks following the destruction of Tokyo, American planners accelerated the new strategy. LeMay's doctrine of low-altitude incendiary raids became standard across Japan. Night after night, waves of B-29s rose from the Marianas, their bomb bays loaded not with high explosives but with fire. Targets included Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama, all major urban centers where military workshops were interwoven with civilian neighborhoods. The raids were designed to paralyze production by annihilating the physical and social fabric that supported it. The methods were systematic. Cities were mapped into zones, each assigned a pattern of bombing runs that would guarantee saturation. Reconnaissance photographs were compared with Japanese census data to calculate population density, building types, and likely fire breaks. The goal was not only to destroy industry, but to create chaos, overwhelming the civil defense network, displacing millions, and forcing the Japanese government to confront an unmanageable humanitarian disaster. This shift blurred the boundary between military and civilian targets in a way unprecedented in modern warfare. The results were staggering. On March 13th, Nagoya's industrial districts and residential wards were reduced to ash, leaving over 500,000 homeless. Osaka followed on March 14th and 15th, where high winds carried flames through the city's crowded merchant quarters. Kobe burned on March 16th, with fires consuming over a fifth of the city in a single night. By May, Yokohama, Japan's second-largest port, was struck so heavily that over 40% of its buildings were gone. Each city was transformed into a landscape of scorched earth and shattered infrastructure. Civilian testimonies reveal the scale of human loss behind the statistics. Families who fled Tokyo often found themselves burned out again in other cities as the fire bow. By May 1945, the firebombing campaign had reached its peak. Nearly every major Japanese city, with the exception of Kyoto, had been targeted. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. More than 60 cities were struck, many multiple times, leaving vast portions of urban Japan in ruins. Conservative estimates suggest that by the summer, over 300,000 civilians had been killed in incendiary raids, with millions more displaced. The United States had achieved what no other air force in history had accomplished: the systematic dismantling of an entire nation's urban centers through fire alone. The scale of destruction was not accidental. It was the product of detailed calculations carried out by analysts working under LeMay. Economists and statisticians assessed the value of urban areas in terms of production lost versus tonnage of bombs dropped. They measured success not in battles won, but in percentage of city area burned. In many cases, the destruction of housing was considered as critical as the destruction of factories because workers without homes could not return to production lines. These metrics transformed civilian neighborhoods into legitimate military objectives, a reasoning that blurred the distinction between strategic necessity and terror. Within Japan, the psychological toll was immense. Constant raids shattered morale, as air raid sirens became nightly alarms for mass flight and panic. Families lived in perpetual displacement, moving from one burned-out district to another. Children were evacuated to rural areas, often separated from their parents indefinitely. Those who remained in the cities endured nights of suffocating smoke and days of digging through rubble for food, water, or missing relatives. Survivors later described an unshakable sense of vulnerability, that nowhere within Japan was beyond reach of the bombers. From the American perspective, the firebombing was presented as a necessary alternative to a full-scale invasion. Estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned Allied landing on the Japanese home islands, predicted hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. By destroying cities from the air, military leaders argued, Japan might be forced to surrender before an invasion became necessary. Yet within the secrecy of command rooms, there was also acknowledgement that the raids were a grim experiment, testing the limits of incendiary warfare on an unprecedented scale. Tokyo had been the beginning, but by May, all of Japan's major population centers lay under the shadow of fire. By June 1945, the cumulative effects of the incendiary campaign had pushed Japan into a state of near collapse. Industrial output fell sharply as workshops and small factories vanished under the destruction of entire neighborhoods. Transportation networks strained under the weight of millions displaced, while warehouses, rail depots, and shipping facilities lay in ruins. The government attempted to maintain order through rationing and propaganda, but the scale of civilian suffering exceeded any system's ability to manage. Reports circulated of families reduced to subsisting on roots, weeds, and scraps pulled from the debris of burned-out kitchens. The destruction of homes proved just as damaging as the loss of factories. Surveys conducted after the war revealed that over 2.5 million houses had been destroyed during the bombing campaign, leaving nearly 9 million people homeless. Crowded refugee camps sprang up across rural Japan, hastily constructed from salvaged wood and corrugated metal. Disease spread quickly in these camps, with typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition claiming lives even in regions untouched by direct raids. The civilian population bore the brunt of the campaign, experiencing not only the terror of fire, but the grinding attrition of survival in a nation systematically stripped of shelter and resources. In military terms, the firebombing was judged highly effective. American intelligence concluded that Japan's aircraft production had dropped by more than 60% by mid-1945. Key industrial districts such as those in Osaka and Nagoya had been rendered useless, and shipping capacity was crippled. What remained of Japan's war economy was a fraction of its former strength. Yet despite these devastating losses, the Japanese government refused to surrender. Militarist factions within the leadership insisted on continuing the fight, preparing civilians for a last-ditch defense of the home islands. This refusal ensured that the firebombing campaign continued. By the summer, smaller regional cities, once overlooked in favor of larger industrial hubs, were placed on target lists. Towns like Toyama, Fukui, and Hachioji, with populations in the hundreds of thousands rather than millions, were subjected to complete annihilation. Toyama, often described as the Japanese Pittsburgh for its concentration of aluminum production, was burned to the ground in a single raid, with over 99% of its urban area destroyed. The pattern revealed the unrelenting logic of the strategy. If destruction of Tokyo could not force surrender, then the obliteration of every significant urban center across the nation would. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, the raids intensified with ruthless consistency. Each night, formations of B-29s departed from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, their routes plotted with mathematical precision. While the missions were presented publicly as attacks on Japan's industrial backbone, the reality on the ground showed that entire cities, regardless of military value, were consumed by fire. Medium-sized cities like Kofu, Mito, and Okazaki, places known more for cultural significance than armament production, were reduced to ash within hours. The strategy had evolved into one of total war, erasing the line between combatant and civilian. Toyama provided one of the clearest examples of this new reality. On the night of August the 1st, nearly the entire city was obliterated by 173 bombers in just a few hours. Over 95% of its buildings were destroyed, leaving little more than scorched earth where a thriving industrial hub had once stood. Survivors described fire spreading so quickly that entire families were consumed before they could flee. Streets vanished under rivers of flame, while underground shelters collapsed in the heat, entombing those who had sought refuge. Toyama's destruction became symbolic of the campaign's ultimate capacity, not to cripple, but to erase. American command staff evaluated these operations in terms of efficiency. Reports compared bomb tonnage, percentage of area destroyed, and estimated production losses. Cities were listed in tables, reduced to figures and percentages that marked the progress of Japan's collapse. Within these documents, the suffering of millions was abstracted into statistics. A successful mission was defined by how completely a city's fabric could be transformed into ash. For the Japanese people, the sense of despair deepened. Refugees crowded into rural villages, overwhelming limited food supplies. Farms became the last line of survival, but shortages grew severe as transportation networks remained broken. Government broadcasts urged civilians to endure and resist, painting the bombings as a test of national spirit. Yet privately, even officials recognized that the nation was on the verge of total collapse. Cities that had stood for centuries, rich with cultural heritage and traditions, were vanishing in nights of fire. By August, nearly every urban center of significance had been targeted, leaving Japan's people trapped between starvation on the ground and annihilation from the sky. The devastation reached a new threshold in early August 1945, when Japan's already ruined cities faced a weapon unlike anything used before. On August 6th, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. In an instant, the city was engulfed by a blinding flash, followed by a shockwave that flattened buildings across miles. Temperatures at the blast's core soared beyond imagination, incinerating tens of thousands instantly. Fires raged across what remained, merging with the destruction into a scene that dwarfed even the firebombings in speed and concentration of death. Nearly 70,000 people were killed that day, with tens of thousands more succumbing to injuries and radiation in the weeks that followed. 3 days later, on August the 9th, another B-29 boxcar carried the second atomic bomb toward Kokura, but weather obscured the city. The crew diverted to Nagasaki, where the weapon detonated over the Urakami Valley. Though the city's geography limited the spread compared to Hiroshima, the destruction was still immense. Industrial plants and civilian districts alike were obliterated, and an estimated 40,000 people perished almost immediately. Survivors endured radiation burns, illness, and long-term effects that no previous weapon of war had inflicted. The atomic bombings did not occur in isolation, but against the backdrop of the incendiary campaign that had already leveled much of urban Japan. For many Japanese civilians, the atomic attacks seemed a continuation of the same nightmare, another stage in a relentless pattern of destruction. By this time, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and dozens of other cities had already been consumed by fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as final symbols of escalation, weapons capable of concentrating the devastation of entire fleets of bombers into a single strike. In Washington and military headquarters in the Pacific, the officials debated the morality and necessity of these new weapons. Some argued that Japan was already effectively defeated by firebombing and blockade, and that surrender was imminent without atomic intervention. Others believed the bombs were essential to demonstrate overwhelming power, not only to Japan, but to the world at large, particularly the Soviet Union, which had just declared war on Japan. For the Japanese people, however, the distinction mattered little. By mid-August, after years of war and months of systematic annihilation from the skies, the nation faced devastation on a scale unprecedented in history. The combined force of fire and atomic weapons had reduced Japan's cities to ruins and its society to the brink of collapse. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast across Japan in a radio address unlike any the nation had ever heard. Speaking in formal, archaic language, he informed his people that Japan would accept the terms of surrender laid out in the Potsdam Declaration. For millions of Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice. The message was veiled, avoiding direct mention of defeat, yet its meaning was clear. The war was over. The announcement followed days of internal struggle within the Japanese leadership, where factions of the military had argued fiercely against surrender, despite the atomic bombings and the firebombing campaign that had already shattered the nation. The emperor's decision came not solely from the atomic strikes, though they carried unprecedented shock. It was the cumulative effect of months of devastation, the loss of Tokyo and dozens of other cities, the displacement of millions, the collapse of industry, and the certainty that continued resistance would bring total annihilation. The Soviet Union's entry into the war on August 8th, launching a massive invasion of Japanese forces in Manchuria, further sealed Japan's fate. Surrounded on all fronts, deprived of resources, and with its cities already reduced to ashes, Japan's leaders recognized that no path to victory remained. Across the nation, the reaction to surrender was complex. In urban ruins, survivors wept with a mixture of relief and despair. Some rejoiced that the bombings had ended, that their children might live without fear of sirens and firestorms. Others mourned not only the lives lost, but the destruction of communities, traditions, and cultural heritage that had been consumed in the flames. Soldiers returning from distant battlefields found their homes gone, their families scattered or dead. The surrender ended the war, but it also left Japan standing amid one of the most complete urban devastations ever recorded. For the Allies, the victory validated a strategy that had been tested and expanded over the course of months. Incendiary bombing had demonstrated its capacity to dismantle a modern industrial society, while the atomic bomb provided a concentrated symbol of technological dominance. Together, they had forced surrender without the land invasion that military planners had feared would claim millions of lives. Yet in the aftermath, questions lingered. Questions about the moral cost of targeting civilians, about whether the destruction of so many cities had been necessary, and about the precedent such weapons of mass devastation had set for the future of warfare. The end of the war revealed the full scope of devastation inflicted on Japan's cities. Surveys conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, documented the damage with clinical precision. Photographers captured endless stretches of rubble where neighborhoods had once stood, and statisticians compiled figures that reduced human loss to charts and percentages. Their findings showed that by August 1945, 66 urban centers had been attacked, with an average of 40% of each city destroyed. Some, like Toyama, were almost completely annihilated, while others, such as Tokyo and Osaka, had lost vast swaths of their urban core. The civilian cost was staggering. Over 330,000 people were killed in incendiary raids alone, a figure exceeding the combined deaths from both atomic bombs. Millions more suffered injuries, starvation, and homelessness. Refugee families drifted across the countryside, searching for shelter in temples, barns, or makeshift huts built from debris. Diseases spread rapidly, and malnutrition became endemic. For many survivors, the trauma of fire was compounded by the long, slow struggle to endure in a nation stripped of its cities. Oral testimonies later revealed the depth of this suffering. Children who had watched parents perish in firestorms, mothers who wandered through ruins in search of lost sons, and communities that never reassembled after being scattered by destruction. Internationally, the campaign stirred debate even as it was initially overshadowed by the atomic bombings. In the immediate post-war period, Allied leaders defended the fire raids as necessary steps to end the conflict quickly and to avoid a ground invasion that might have cost millions of lives on both sides. Yet critics argued that the scale of civilian targeting represented a form of total war that blurred into indiscriminate destruction. Questions arose about whether the firebombing had truly shortened the war, or whether Japan, already weakened by blockade and invasion threats, might have surrendered without the annihilation of so many urban centers. For Japan itself, recovery was slow and uneven. Cities that had once been commercial and cultural hubs now faced the task of rebuilding from foundations scorched into the earth. Families returned to find entire districts erased, landmarks gone, and histories buried beneath rubble. Yet amidst the ruins, reconstruction began, often with the help of salvaged wood, tin, and stone pulled from the ashes. The scale of loss was almost incomprehensible, but it marked the beginning of a transformation. From the devastation of firebombing and atomic attack, Japan would eventually rise into a new era, its urban identity reshaped forever by the destruction it endured. In the years that followed, historians and survivors grappled with the legacy of the incendiary campaign. For many outside Japan, the firebombings remained overshadowed by the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, yet the scale of the earlier raids told a different story. Tokyo's destruction alone had claimed more lives than either atomic bombing, and the campaign as a whole had left a trail of devastation across dozens of cities. The memory of these nights of fire lingered in testimony, diaries, and photographs, though in international consciousness they often stood in the shadow of nuclear warfare. Within Japan, survivors preserved accounts of the raids, passing on memories of unbearable heat, walls of flame, and the disintegration of entire neighborhoods within minutes. These stories became central to understanding not only the suffering of civilians, but also the transformation of urban life in the post-war years. Rebuilding efforts took decades, with some districts never returning to their pre-war form. Families dispersed permanently, cultural landmarks were lost, and communities that had once defined the identity of cities were gone forever. The firebombings were not only acts of destruction, but also agents of social upheaval, reshaping how Japan rebuilt itself after surrender. The ethical debates grew sharper as time passed. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey itself concluded in 1946 that Japan might have surrendered even without the atomic bombs or continued firebombing, given the country's desperate condition by mid-1945. Critics argued that the targeting of civilian areas constituted an indiscriminate use of force, testing the boundaries of what modern warfare could justify. Defenders maintained that the raids prevented a land invasion that would have cost far more lives. This clash of perspectives ensured that the legacy of the firebombings would remain contested, caught between military logic and humanitarian outrage. In the broader history of warfare, the incendiary campaign against Japan marked a turning point. It demonstrated how entire societies could be dismantled through aerial bombardment, setting a precedent for the destructive potential of modern air power. The lessons of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless smaller cities became part of the story of the 20th century, a demonstration of technological capacity, human resilience, and the devastating cost of strategies that erase the line between soldier and civilian. The firebombings did not fade with the war's end. They remained a haunting reminder of what modern conflict could unleash, shaping both memory and morality in the post-war world.